research. Her science education research interests are mostly concerned with assessing and improving and how students understand biological concepts and apply scientific principles, especially those related to ecology. And she's worked both at the undergrad and middle and high school levels. Her ecology research bridges community and ecosystem ecology, and she explores how plants and soils respond to external factors like herbivory, nutrients, and infectious diseases and climate change. The model system that she's worked on in her graduate degree until today is the black-tailed prairie dog communities and the impact of bubonic plague. So I'm really excited to have Laurel here today. She's focusing today in her talk on her in your science education research. And I'm looking forward to hearing what she has for us today. Thank you for coming too.
Oh yeah, thank you so much for inviting me, Jenny. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. I would love to come to Nebraska. I haven't been to University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I've never been to Lincoln. I would have loved to come, but I've got 2 small kids and it's hard to travel in the current conditions. So as Jenny mentioned, I did a postdoc in science education at Michigan State University, and much of what I'm going to talk about today stems from collaborations with people that I met there. And I met Jenny and Joe Dower at Michigan State University, and I thank them for inviting me. So today I'm going to talk about student reasoning about ecological systems and change. See if I can figure out how to advance the slide. Uh-oh. There we go. Okay. So I have to thank some research partners, some folks that we met at Michigan State University, and especially Jennifer Doherty and Cornelia Harris or Leah Harris. We did the majority of this work coding answers, and that I'll talk about, lots of student interviews, talking with a whole lot of students. Andy Anderson advised the work, and Alan Berkowitz and John Moore too. And I will talk about some of the work that we've done with Jenny Dower and Ashley Allred, who is a graduate student, I believe, in your department. And I'll preview some work by my past graduate student, Polly, and my current graduate student, Julie Bile. So these are our research goals. Our first goal was to develop a learning progression for reasoning about ecological systems. And our second goal was to describe the state of understanding of a large cross-section of students and teachers in the United States, to explore the relationship between student recognition of biodiversity and their ability to reason about ecological systems, to explore student explanations of variation, and this is Ashley's work. And finally, to develop a teaching experiment to see if we could move students efficiently up the learning progression and get them to a high level of achievement. So we want students to be able to reason about ecological systems. And so how do they do that? This reasoning ability is really important if we expect students to make citizenship decisions that preserve biodiversity and ecosystem function. But it's hard. And it's hard because reasoning requires systems thinking. It requires understanding the structure of a system. That means the components and the elements of the system. And it requires understanding the relationship among the parts of a system, so the functions and the processes within the system and the principles that govern those relationships. So I'll talk about the first goal, which was to develop a learning progression for reasoning about ecological systems. So what is a learning progression? Learning progressions are descriptions of successively more sophisticated ways of thinking about a topic that can follow on one another as a student learns about and investigates a topic over a broad span of time. And the learning progression I'll talk about today went from grades 6 through 12. So a learning progression is anchored at the lower end by what we know about how younger students reason. And this is all empirically determined by talking to students. And then it's anchored at the upper end by what experts in the field believe students should understand when they graduate. And the learning progression seeks to explain how that happens and see if we can make it efficient and make it so that students can achieve a high level of understanding. This is what a learning progression framework looks like. You've got progress variables here, and those are things that you can ask anybody about. You can ask a 6-year-old about it. You can ask a graduate student. You could ask a professional ecologist about it. For example, if we were talking about forest fire and the impacts of forest fire, which is a common disturbance where I live, a young student could talk about the settings, the biotic and abiotic relationships, and the change they might expect. You could also ask really similar questions of a professional fire ecologist, and they would also be able to tell you about those changes. And the levels of achievement here are the levels that we go through as we get more and more sophisticated explanations of a phenomenon. And the learning performances, what we fill in this area here is all empirically determined by talking to students. So how do you create a learning progression? Well, first you define your content area, and the content area that we were interested in was community and systems or ecosystem ecology. Then you observe patterns in student thinking by doing both literature searches of past research and then some pilot studies like interviewing students to see what they initially say. Then you construct a framework. And this is your hypothesized model that describes how we think students progress from lower level understanding to upper level understanding. And then you test that model by doing assessments and teaching experiments. And then you refine the model, revise it based on what you learn. Then you test it again and revise it. And we did 5 cycles of revision for our learning progression. We had 2 approaches, a written assessment approach and an interview approach. We had a very large sample of 315 teachers and over 6,000 students in grades 6 through 12 in 5 states. And we asked them lots of questions. And then we did some validation interviews, which are slightly different than the interviews I'll talk about in a minute. Here's a sample question. You have 2 identical bags and you fill them with the same amount and type of leaves. You put the identical bags in 2 different areas of a stream. After several weeks, one set of leaves has almost disappeared and the bag is full of organisms. The other set of leaves is still mostly whole and the bag has few organisms in it. What are some ways the 2 different areas of the stream could be different? How might these experiences or differences explain why the leaf packs in one area have more organisms than the leaf packs in another area? So we ask students questions like this and we see what they say. But assessing student understanding of ecosystems is really hard, and doing it with written assessments is really hard. And one of the reasons for that is that ecosystems are complex and contingent. They're governed by a large variety of principles that vary in importance depending on your context and the scale at which you're looking. And many people, I think, in this room are ecologists or do work in ecology, and you probably know how frustrating ecology work is because it's complex and because it's contingent. And another reason that it's hard to assess students' understanding of ecosystems is that students lack experiences with the natural world. They either have very few experiences or their experiences are geographically constrained. And many of the students in our sample size were urban and suburban students who really didn't get outside much. So we had a secondary approach besides the written assessment items that we asked. We also developed 3 scenarios about ecological disturbance. And I'll tell you about those scenarios in a minute. We did semi-structured interviews, which were about 45 minutes each, with 46 grades 6 through 12 students and 7 undergrads and grads in ecology. And those people or those students were from rural and suburban Michigan, suburban Colorado, and urban Maryland. Scenario 1 was about Python introduction to the Florida Everglades. So we would show students some photos. We would give them things like a food web to reason about and ask questions. Scenario 2 was about habitat fragmentation and Lyme disease risk. So with habitat fragmentation, you get urbanization and a change in community composition, which increases Lyme disease risk because the white-footed mouse is the most competent host of Lyme disease. So we showed them that scenario and asked a bunch of questions. The third scenario was about loss of kelp forest habitat in California. So we showed them pictures of a kelp forest and urchin barren and food webs and ask questions about that. So when we analyzed the interviews, we would transcribe them and look for trends in how students talked about ecosystem structure. So these were settings and relationships, abiotic and biotic relationships. And we asked them about change and change in response to disturbance. We asked them what they thought caused change, what the consequences of change were, and what they predicted would happen and the constraints on those predictions. So this figure is going to show you the indicators for the type of reasoning. Those are kind of the number of statements students make and learning progression level. So as we go up in learning progression level, we see fewer and fewer statements where students are describing organisms as actors in settings with anthropomorphic, teleological, and essentialist descriptions. And when I give you some examples, I'll kind of explain what I mean by anthropomorphic. Teleological means with a purpose. Essentialist means just paying attention to the outward, most obvious characteristics of a species and not variation within. And then as we go up the learning progression level, what we see is that students start to see ecological systems as hierarchical systems. They start to notice variability in space and variability in time. They start to give you mechanistic explanations for their predictions rather than anthropomorphic explanations. And they start to accept things like randomness. So we gave students comparison tasks, and these were in these areas. So traits of organisms and life cycles, population change over time and space. For example, how does the python population change over time and space? Interactions among organisms and interactions among organisms and their environment. So we gave them questions in those categories. And what we saw was upper anchor at the higher level, people and students would describe things or describe systems as nested hierarchies. So individuals within populations, within communities, within ecosystems. But lower level students would describe ecological scenarios as actors with enablers and settings. So they would pick individuals and kind of think of them as the star of the show. And those individuals were within families. And they had relationships, often anthropomorphic relationships. And those relationships took place in places or settings. And they were likely to describe an environment more in terms of a stage. So in the next 3 slides, I will give you some examples of lower level attributes and some quotes from students. At the lower level, students tended to focus on the individuals. So they looked at the individual scale. They thought a lot about human agency, and things happen because of human agency, and they tended to infuse a lot of drama in their explanations. Here's an example. How do you think the Burmese python got to the Florida Everglades? I think someone smuggled it in their suitcase. Some people do it for drugs. They tended to view environment in terms of general suitability, like, is it a good place? Is it a bad place? Will they like it there? Do you think we might see the python become more abundant in other parts of the US? They might spread in the South because the weather's pretty. They tended to focus on direct interactions between organisms. For example, is there a way that the python can change the population of plants? No, they're usually a meat eater. Could they change anything about the non-living parts? Not really, because it's just there and the python can't wipe it out or get rid of it. So when they were looking at a food web, they would only see one direct interaction. They tended to explain events in terms of free will or wants. Will some pythons not have the new trait after they're in Florida? Yes, because they're so used to being from native Asia, so they kind of want to have something to remember that by. And there you can see some anthropomorphizing. They had an overly simplistic view of responses to change. What do you think might happen if things become overpopulated? Well, it might throw the system out of whack, but everything has a purpose and they all play some purpose in the ecosystem, and so that might change it. They used a lot of anthropomorphic analogies. The slight differences that you're describing, would they pass those differences on to their babies right away? Like for us kids that move, like they're young and then they move to a different state and a new school, they take time to adapt. So sometimes analogies are helpful, but sometimes they're not, and especially when they're anthropomorphic and inappropriate. This is not how adaptation happens. And finally, they invoke a lot of learning instead of natural selection when they talk about adaptation in response to change. How does that happen? I don't know if it's the traits as much as their parents just teaching them as they grow up, like showing them that if you want to live, you have to be aggressive. So those were the lower level responses. Here are some attributes of middle level responses. Middle level students tended to focus on populations and communities. So they didn't just see individuals, they saw populations, and that was a big step between the lower level and the middle level. They also saw indirect connections among organisms, so they wouldn't just see one arrow up or down in a food web. So here's a picture of an area that used to be a kelp forest before the otters died out. So can you explain the disappearance of the kelp? The sea otters died, then the populations below them, like the sea urchin, starfish, and larger crabs and other fish, they were able to increase in their population because they weren't being preyed upon. They're eating more of the smaller fish, the abalone, and smaller predatory fish. So this student was seeing direct connections beyond just the direct connections. They linked actions of populations and individuals to survival and reproduction. They saw changes in population size. They noticed changes over a life cycle. And they also started to think about randomness. How do you think they got there? Their seeds, the embryos might have traveled over the current, with the current. So this student was looking at different pieces, was talking maybe about one stage in a life cycle, a grown plant, but they mentioned seeds. They saw that they thought organisms could affect the environment locally. So they didn't see far away connections, but local effects. How do you think the introduction of the python has changed this food web? Like some of the underwater plants, you could see them dying off just because the amount of snake traffic that would be going through it and everything. So they thought that the snake was trampling the vegetation. But they did see how an organism could affect its environment. Here are some attributes of upper level respondents or responses. Upper level students tended to go across all scales. So they didn't just focus on individuals, they didn't just focus on communities, they could go from microscopic things all the way up to the ecosystem scale. They gave very rich abiotic descriptions with lots of attributes. So they wouldn't just say climate, they would give you specific attributes of climate. And they would talk about spatial variation and temporal variation. Is there anything different about the Everglades from those other two states that I've mentioned? Yeah, so the Everglades, I think even at their driest, still have some standing water in some places. They talked about actions being the result of genes times environment, randomness and emergent properties. For example, so there's these two sibling sets, one in Burma and one in Florida. Would you expect the traits of the baby pythons born in Burma to be different than the traits of the baby pythons born in Florida? No, I imagine they would be the same. Whatever genetics or series of traits that they get from both parents, as well as the environmental controls, mostly dealing with what resources they're able to gather. They invoked the idea of functional redundancy. Would you expect there to be a lot of variability among the raccoons in a given area? There is variability potentially in who's there, but their capabilities might be the same. So you have different organisms filling the same functional role. They talked about interactions between organisms, and they took it even a step further by acknowledging that not all interactions are equally important. They saw relative strengths of interactions, or talked about relative strengths of interactions. And they saw changes in interactions over the course of a life cycle. How would you say, using this diagram, that the introduction of the python has changed this food web? The juveniles will probably be the ones eating lower in this food web. So the frog, the carp, and the turtle are probably fed on the juvenile, and the middle-aged ones. And then the adults are the ones feeding on the birds, the alligator, and the raccoon. They also saw indirect effects and aggregate effects. Would the disappearance of the kelp in these sea urchin barrens change anything about the abiotic environment on that stretch of the coast? A really dense kelp forest would do a lot to dampen the effect of wave action. If you lose all the kelp, then you have increased erosion damage and things like that. This was actually a really sophisticated answer, linking a biotic factor to something abiotic like erosion. And they also placed constraints on the ability to respond to change. So those lower level students kind of said that everything would adapt, and upper level students said some things would adapt and some things might not, and it depends on blank. In terms of their tolerance for colder temperatures, how complicated would it be for them to change their physiology? That would be a pretty complicated series, to change a whole series of enzymes that allow them to undergo cellular respiration. So I would imagine that evolutionary leaps on temperature tolerance are probably slow. So you see here, the students talking about a micro level process like enzymes and cellular respiration, linking that to physiology at the organismal level and even to evolution. So that's pretty sophisticated. So to recap, if we're talking about attributes of the system, lower level students, let's look at the focal scale. So what did they focus on? Lower level students focused on individuals, and they kind of made those individuals actors in their scene. Middle level students focused on populations and communities. So this is a really big transition to focusing from going from individuals to populations. That was kind of a hallmark of middle level reasoning. And higher level students could reason across scales, many times very easily, going from a microscopic thing to an ecosystem scale. So how do they describe their environment or describe an environment? Lower level students talked about general suitability. Like a python is suited to that kind of climate. They talked about what organisms like. They used essentialist descriptions, like it's got to be warm. They had a fuzzy distinction between biotic and abiotic parts. For example, a lower level student would be just as likely to tell you that a tree was abiotic as they would be to say that it's biotic. Middle level students talked about specific abiotic factors. So they didn't just say things like weather. They said temperature and moisture and humidity. They talked about tolerance ranges of organisms, and they linked the environment. When they talked about suitability, like a python is suited to this, they explained, they had some physiological reasons for that. Higher level students gave really rich abiotic descriptions, and they brought in ideas about spatial and temporal variation. Sometimes that variation was just inherent in the system, normal variability, and sometimes it was about disturbance. How did they describe interactions? Lower level students described direct interactions only, so one step up or down on a food web. They used a whole lot of anthropomorphic analogies like helping and harming. Middle level students saw indirect interactions, and they linked those indirect interactions to population regulation. So that middle level thinking, that population part's very important, that they start to see populations. Higher level students saw relative strengths of interactions, changes in interactions over life stages, space, or time. When describing why a system was how it was, lower level students would talk a lot about free will of organisms, or it was because something that humans did. The organisms wanted it, or the humans changed something. Middle level students, when they talked about why things were in a system, they talked about it in terms of populations surviving and reproducing, or individuals surviving and reproducing, or being part of a life cycle of an organism. Higher level students brought in the idea of genes and environment interaction. And they also acknowledged that stochastic factors, random factors could influence the why of why something was. In terms of change, the point of view or scale at which the lower level students looked at change is they would focus on an individual and its immediate surroundings. Middle level students tend to focus on single populations, and higher level students focused across scales and talked about different populations in a community. In terms of causes of change, lower level students thought that change was the result of free will of organisms or actions of humans, and they often thought every change was a disruption to the natural order or the way things should be. Middle level students, when they described change or the causes of change, they would talk about an event. And the event could have lots of different causes, including non-human causes or non-human organisms. Higher level students talked about events. They talked about stochastic factors. They talked just about inherent variability within a system. And they also talked about collective actions of multiple organisms. And this is super important if you want to think about things like climate change, or if you want people to reason about how multiple organisms could be taking actions that have an emergent effect. In terms of responses to change, lower level students gave really simplistic answers, like everything's going to go extinct, or they were super positive, like the organisms are all going to adapt and they'll learn. Middle level students talked about adaptation, but they didn't talk about adaptation in a natural selection sort of way. They had a very incomplete understanding of natural selection. But they did start to invoke ideas about functional redundancy. And at the higher level, students talked about natural selection. They talked about genetic resources. They could talk about relative pace of change. So two species that may have interactions, one might be able to change in one way and one might not. So they talked about that. They also started to talk about the matrix, or where a particular environment was situated within other environments. And they talked about how that matters because of its effects on dispersal. So to summarize all that again, as students progress, they develop a recognition of hierarchical structure within systems. They reduce their reliance on inappropriate analogies. And it's not that analogies are always bad. Sometimes analogies are appropriate, but not always when they're anthropomorphic. They move from describing biodiversity through the lens of essentialism to describing both central tendency and variability. For example, if you asked, if you showed them two pictures of prairie dogs and said, how do they vary? They would say, they would have a lot more ideas about the different ways that they might vary physiologically, gender, lots of different things. And they move from describing ecological systems as dynamic rather than static. So lower level students think systems are the way they always have been. And if they change, it's because of something bad. And upper level students think change is normal. So once we had our framework for the learning progression, we wanted to think about the state of understanding across a large section of students in the US. This figure shows student proficiency on that learning progression. And here's the low level, middle, and high level that I was talking about. And it's in a row because students are ranked from the lowest to the highest. So what we see is most students are very low. They're on the lower end. There are some students crossing into the middle, but very few students are reaching the highest level of achievement on that learning progression framework. This is their proficiency score again, and the MS is middle school, pre and post, and this is pre-post a learning experiment or a teaching unit that I'll talk about later. High school, pre-post, and teachers. So what we see is as students get more experience, they get better at their reasoning. The third goal was to explore the relationship between student recognition of biodiversity and their ability to reason about ecological systems. So what biodiversity do students recognize? Darwin and his contemporaries were naturalists, and it was only after they began noticing and exploring and describing and cataloging Earth's biodiversity that scientists began to look for causes and consequences of the biodiversity in natural systems. So we sought to think about, how does this apply to students? And we hypothesized that with experience with the natural world, familiarity with biodiversity is requisite for children to develop thinking about ecological systems and processes. So they needed to spend time noticing and observing. Here's a question that we asked students. Please name as many different species or kinds of living things in your backyard as you can. And then please name as many different species living in your backyard or neighborhood as you can that are not big enough to see with your eyes. So actually we asked middle school, high school, and teachers this. And here's what we saw. So this is middle school, high school teachers, and the average number of responses. So that you could think of this as species richness in terms of vertebrates, invertebrates, plants, and microbes. So what we see is teachers name a greater richness of species, especially plants. And hardly anybody names very many microbes. So microbes are not something that students tend to recognize, which is not too surprising. We also know that we calculated the Simpsons diversity for their block of answers of the things that they could name. And we saw teachers named a greater diversity of organisms than the students did. And there wasn't a whole lot of difference between middle and high school. It was no difference really. We also looked at whether people gave general answers or specific categories, for example, a bird versus a western meadowlark. And what we see is that students name a lot more general organisms than specific organisms. And then we wondered, how is their ability to name organisms related to their performance on the learning progression? So where they were on the learning progression, and this is their ability estimate, or how well they performed on that learning progression. And the more diversity, specificity, and richness was correlated with their performance on the learning progression. We don't know cause versus effect, but it is something that we want to explore further. Next, we explored student explanations of variation. And in this one, I'll talk about Ashley Allred's work. And Ashley Allred was a student of Jenny Dower at your institution. So here's a question. If you wanted to preserve the lynx, an endangered big cat, by starting a captive breeding program and then reintroducing the offspring into the wild, how would you select a group of lynx for your program? What characteristics would you look for? And how many lynx would you choose? So this is what we called our captive breeding question. And we used all kinds of different organisms. We used sturgeons and birds and polar bears. And in Colorado, we used the lynx. So what variation or attributes do students mention? At the lower level, they mentioned physical attributes, habitat, abilities, and they were very anthropomorphic. Here's an example. I would look for active, friendly polar bears because no one likes mean, grumpy bears. So this is an anthropomorphic answer. And again, it's polar bears because some of the question prompts were polar bears. In the middle level, they picked attributes for survival and reproduction, or they would kind of give eugenic-y sorts of answers like good attributes. So the largest and strongest birds would be the ones I would choose first because they will last the longest and produce offspring that would last long and produce more offspring. And why do students say that variation is important? At the lower level, they either said it wasn't, they didn't acknowledge it, or they gave answers that looked at dichotomous things like male or female, old or young. Here's an example. I would select the oldest ones and the youngest. I would look for the oldest as I started to choose all the oldest 6 and the youngest 6. In the middle level, they acknowledged that variation is good, but they didn't always give a reason for why variation is good. So diversity is good. And sometimes they would say variation prevents inbreeding. Here's an example. I would ideally have a breeding stock of 200 to work with, enough to prevent happenings of incest, which could weaken the genes of the species as a whole. But weaken the genes is not a very specific explanation of why inbreeding is bad. At the upper level, they talked about variation being important for resilience and responding to change. I would choose individuals of mass variety, or else it could come to a point where the genome is so consistent that one targeted disease to the genome would wipe out the whole population, or at least has the potential to. So one thing I think is really important, and there are a lot of studies coming out about the idea of variation and variability. And I personally think that variation is a threshold concept. Once people can start to recognize variability instead of just central tendency, they can understand a whole lot about ecosystems, a whole lot about biology. Our last goal was to develop a teaching experiment to see if we could move students up the learning progression. And the teaching experiment was highly tailored to those things I was talking about earlier, like getting people to understand populations, getting people to understand dispersal, functional redundancy, things like that. So the 2-week teaching unit was related to invertebrates colonizing leaf packs in the stream. So students did an experiment where they took some leaves and then they put them in these mesh bags and put them out into a stream. And then they brought them back in and looked at what they saw. And in between, they did lessons. And the students explored functional and taxonomic diversity. They learned about food web relationships. And they learned about the ways in which abiotic and biotic factors determine what organisms are present in the community. So they would do experiments like putting some bags in a pool and some in a riffle, some in one stream, some in another. And what we found is that students did better on the pre than the post test, but gains varied by class. So some teachers had bigger gains than other teachers. Our first hypothesis is that maybe student learning gains were related to teacher understanding of ecology. So we looked at the correlation between the teacher's ability estimate and their average class learning gain, and we did not see a relationship. What we did see is a relationship between, a bit of a relationship between average class learning gain and the percentage of lessons implemented. One thing that we didn't expect is to have, for teachers not to be have high fidelity of implementation. So some teachers took out some lessons and replaced them with others. They might have skipped certain parts because they ran out of time. So the lessons implemented, the more fidelity of implementation we had, the higher the learning gain. So we need citizens to be able to use systems-based reasoning about disturbance because of lots of ecological disturbances that are happening globally and locally. But it's a really hard thing to do. And it's hard because we're expecting students to link microscopic processes to macroscopic events. So we want them to be able to reason across scales. We want them to see and understand variation or variability. And that variability is between organisms or within populations, over life cycles, over time, over space. We want them to accept that randomness could be a structuring element, like not everything has a reason. So getting away from this teleological way of reasoning. We want them to be able to reason about emergent processes. So collective effects of individuals can have big scale effects. We want them to use principles to constrain their reasoning. For example, the laws of thermodynamics. We want them to be able to navigate different contexts. So we want them to be able to reason about pythons in the Everglades. We want them to be reason about wildfire. We want them to think about what are the important characteristics or the essential characteristics of a place or of a species. We want them to be able to use analogies to help them think across different contexts, but use appropriate analogies and to understand what's an appropriate analogy here and what analogy is not appropriate. So for example, taking what you know about snakes in general and applying it to a python, that's an appropriate type of analogical thinking. but taking what you know about kids moving to a different middle school and applying that to a python moving from Burma to the United States or the Everglades, that's not an appropriate analogy. So the challenge is, how do we get students from the Disney thinking, the Lion King thinking about ecosystems to principle-based thinking, model-based thinking, quantitative reasoning, hierarchical systems? How do we get them from here to here? Well, we have some ideas. One is giving students a chance to see biodiversity and to recognize variability. So as many opportunities as we can to foster recognition of variability at different scales. So both the recognition of variation is super important and across scales. Things like helping them understand, how does an individual change over time? So from a seed to a big tall plant. How are individuals of the same species different? How are they the same? How does community composition vary over time and space? How do abiotic factors vary over time and space? So they could see that some variation is inherent in a system and it's not always a disturbance. We want to give them chances to explain. We want them to ask them to mechanistically explain a phenomena and constrain their predictions using principles like the laws of conservation of matter and energy, thinking about excess reproduction, thinking about genes interacting with environment, noticing that there are emergent and in aggregate properties, looking at indirect connections, helping them see longer causal chains. And I'll shout out here to Tina Grotzer's work, because she does a lot of long causal chain reasoning. She's at Harvard, she does really good stuff. And here are some new directions that my current student, Julie Bile, this is Julie here, is taking. She's working with to see what funds of knowledge do students use when they reason about ecological systems. When we did those interviews with students with those 3 scenarios, we didn't ask them why they thought a certain way or where they learned something, but that's what Julie's interested in doing. She wants to see where are students learning things, because we don't all learn everything in school. She's working with Latinx students to think about funds of knowledge and working with their families. Another thing we're doing is we're looking at how ecological service learning could relate to reasoning and to stewardship behaviors. And this idea also stems from the idea that a lot of informal education could also increase ecological literacy. This right here is a picture of the Calwood fire, which is a fire that was burning last year outside of Boulder County, Colorado. And Julie's got students doing service learning up at the Calwood fire, replanting, moving different plants, building roads, taking out invasive species. And she'll be doing interviews with those students who have completed service learning. And again, I thank my collaborators, and I can take any questions you have.
Great. Thank you very much, Laurel. For the audience, if you have questions, if you can place those into the chat window, I can convey those to Laurel. And while those are coming, I guess I had a question for you, Laurel, about, because you were talking about variability as kind of a threshold concept. And I was wondering if you can, I guess, maybe just go into more details about why you think understanding variability at different scales is going to improve that reasoning across the scales.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so variation or variability in general is something that students don't always recognize. And that's hard if you want to, for example, think about evolution. You can't think about evolution unless you see variation within a population. I give a question to my students a lot about antibiotic resistance, and they're looking at bacteria, and they don't see one bacterium being different from another. They only see the essential characteristics of the bacteria, and they don't see how they vary I've asked the same question this year related to coronavirus strains. They don't see how virus strains vary from one another. They just see essential features. So that's at the level of evolution, I think seeing variation versus obscuring variation and thinking only about central tendency, I think it's requisite for understanding evolution. The same thing, I think you could apply that to communities as well. Like if you just see a forest as a forest as a forest and not necessarily the variation within the forest, within the trees, you might make inappropriate analogies. Did that answer your question, Joe?
Yeah.
It's really surprising to me how much people tend to obscure variation and only see major characteristics.
Yeah.
I got a question for you, Laurel. Our department is looking a little bit at our introductory ecology course. And I think you gave some really great suggestions for concepts and things to be thinking about while we're thinking about what we're teaching in that class. Are there some like some suggestions or advice you'd give us too on like how to implement some of those things, or some practical ideas, you know, like should we be doing more modeling, or should we be doing more outside stuff and more, you know, hands-on? Like, I don't know, what is.
Yeah, I think a little bit of both. We're revising our series too, so we've been thinking about it a lot, and I don't think we have the answers. But sometimes I've noticed that we tend to want things to be more complicated than maybe they need to be to serve a purpose, like a lesson. I think there's really some good value in noticing and just being immersed in the natural world. But some of that I think has to have some leading with it. So observing in and of itself, like students aren't going to be able to have a framework in which to place those observations that they're making into a context. But Leona Schalbel's work talks a lot about how you can guide students in observations, but that I often think that isn't seen as worthwhile. Like having a student just go out and sit in a place and notice stuff is often thought of as not a proper use of time. But I don't know how you can start to think about the things that govern diversity if you don't even notice diversity in the first place. So some simple stuff like that. But then you mentioned modeling. Yeah, I think modeling is a way to put it all together and to think of the systems approach and see emergent properties. That's why I like Tina Grotzer's stuff. She's got these eco-move. I don't know if you've heard of those. Yeah, I really like that. It's a modeling approach where you go in and out of a system at different scales.
Yeah, it's been interesting this semester as students have been doing this phenology project. I've been using Tammy Long's kind of approach. And so these ecology students are going out and just watching the leaves and the trees are just barely starting to change, but it's kind of interesting to just that they don't they just pass them by normally. And so it's like, but just look up and like, wow, these some leaves are changing, some are not. The same tree, like they're not the same tree, but whoa, I mean, even on the same tree, why are the ones on the bottom still green and the ones on top are red?
Yeah.
You know, like I think just has never occurred that would actually, I don't know. It just, until you ask somebody to observe something,
right,
you don't know.
Right, and give them a framework to observe it with.
Yeah, right.
In Colorado, I work on prairie dogs and they're everywhere, but I'll talk to students about it and they are like, what is that? And then I think to myself, like, how did you get to school today? Like, did you go down the highway? Like on your way home, look to your left. And then you'll see them all like just in the median of the highway. And I think just people just don't notice.
Yeah. You have other questions for Laurel?
I'd love to see the paper from Leona Schalbel or the whatever guided observations.
Yeah.
I'll email you about that.
Okay.
Oh, the chat's disabled, John. Oh, sorry. Oh, can I?
Brooke, you're resourceful. You found a way to.
Thanks.
Very good.
I just had a quick question. I saw that some of like the higher levers you were pulling from college students, correct?
Mhm.
And so with those college students, like what were some of the backgrounds like in biology or natural resources? Because some of the terms they were using, it seemed like really specific and knowledgeable. So I didn't know if you looked at that.
Yeah, they were ecology graduate students.
Ah, okay.
And then I think, if I'm remembering correctly, that Jennifer Doherty might have interviewed some of those students at the Ecological Society of America meeting. So not only were they ecology students, they were invested ecology students. And one of the reasons why we did that is we were having a really hard time getting examples of that upper anchor thinking. Like, we thought that this is where students should be, but no students were there. And it was really hard to find a high school student who would give us those answers. We think they can get there, but they weren't getting there.
Okay. I mean, do you have any like recommendations on how trying to get like high schoolers more at that level, or do you think it is going to have to be more college level just to get to those?
I think college students could get there, like those systems thinking things, like looking at indirect connections and longer causal chains. I think that's really important because, and looking beyond the macro scale, like asking questions that allow students to connect the things they can see with the things they cannot see. And maybe also thinking about local disturbances and local scenarios that might increase the engagement and the familiarity, because sometimes it was hard to ask questions because students didn't understand the context we were talking about. And that's why we gave these big scenario interviews, because we could give them a context and then ask questions, because sometimes when you just go straight to the question, they don't know what you mean.
Absolutely. So do you feel like then it's going to have to be a lot more like classes or things that are really focused more on the ecological, biological aspect, like, or in like a more general sense, just including it more here and there?
Yeah, and there's not a whole lot of ecology in high school. Like, sometimes there's an environmental science class that people take it, but it seems that ecology is always at the end of the book. And it's ignored. And in my state, in Colorado, you don't actually have to take biology or ecology. Like, you just have to take 3 sciences, and it could be physics and chemistry and forensics. So yeah, I don't think they get a whole lot of exposure. And I'm not sure the teachers know a whole lot about it either. Like, some do if they're really interested, but I think we just don't teach a whole lot of ecology. I do really like the next generation science standards and the life science standards. And if we were to follow those, I think they're really good. I don't know if Joe and Jenny agree, but.
Yeah, I did do a zoo academy in high school. So we looked at conservation class and stuff like that when we were there. So I'm thinking about, like, is my understanding super different just because of like one thing I did in high school for a little bit. So yeah, no, thank you very much. This is a really interesting.
Yeah. And I think talking to teachers about these frameworks, if a teacher has a framework and they think about how students are moving up that framework, that helps too. In the teaching experiments we did, we worked closely with teachers to talk about these frameworks, and they co-created the teaching experiment with us.
Mm-hmm.
The implementation just ran into reality.
So sorry about that, everyone. I guess the chat was disabled briefly, but it's back online. And I've got a comment here that I think came just to me, so I'll read it. It's from Ken Chapman. The question is, are there visualization tools that would help with the description of variability? Statistical learning is helped a ton by good visualization tools.
Oh, yeah. There are some like reasoning tools. It's not really a visual tool, but a reasoning tool where you're asking students to find that variability. So when you explain a scenario and you want students to pay attention to that variability, explicitly asking them to find it versus assuming they're going to see it. Like with those bacteria, we might assume that they would think that they vary within the population of bacteria, but the students don't even see that. But I totally agree that statistical tools for understanding variation have been really helpful. I think we need more tools like that. There are tools to look at variation that are kind of like fake environments, like game environments, where you can click buttons and highlight things. That's the eco move that I was talking about.
I think, on top of that is the variability in plants is kind of like totally not ignored, but like so I know we talk about variability, we talk about animals a lot and even microbes, but
Mhm.
when you think about if you go out and look at the trees, they all look, I mean, they would point out things, basically the trees are the same. Not, I mean, obviously there'd be like deciduous and not deciduous, right? Like they would kind of clump them into those kinds of things.
Yeah, those plant blindness
Yeah.
and smoothing over the variation. Yeah.
Well, if there are any last questions, otherwise, we'll thank Laurel.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for inviting me.
Virtual chats or virtual claps. So we appreciate you taking the time to
My
do this
pleasure.
with us, and yeah, we've always appreciated your insights on the ecological side of things. So it's great, and hopefully we can take this away. And I know that Jenny and I are, and there's others here are interested in this ecological, how we're teaching the ecology course. So we'll definitely be in touch.
Yeah, that'd be cool. And I'll have to invite you to Denver now. We'll be talking
We'll take the train out.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Laurel. And like John said, I can't remember the name of the person who's speaking next week. John, do you want to remind us?
Yeah, next week we have Seth Riley from the National Park Service in UCLA. He'll be talking about urban wildlife in the Los Angeles area.
Great. All right. Thank you all, and have a great evening.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Laurel.
Thank you. Bye.